The box arrived on a Tuesday, which was, in Nora's experience, the most unremarkable day of the week, and therefore, a strange day for something to change her life. It was not a large box. It sat on the front step of her apartment building when she came home from work. Addressed in handwriting she recognized immediately, even though she had not seen it in 3 years. Her grandmother's handwriting was unmistakable. All sharp angles and deliberate loops, the kind of penmanship that belonged to a woman who had been taught to write as though the letters mattered. Nora carried it upstairs without opening it, set it on the kitchen table, made herself a cup of tea, and sat across from it for several minutes before she picked up a knife and cut the tape. Inside, packed in tissue paper and smelling faintly of cedar, were a set of folded papers, a small brass key, and a letter addressed simply to Nora in that same sharp handwriting. She opened the letter first. "My dear Nora," it began, "by the time you read this, the lawyers will have already been in touch about the shop. I know you will think it is too much, and too sudden, and that you are not the right person for it. I have left you this key, because I know all of those things too, and I believe you anyway. The shop is yours now. Do with it what you think is right, but read the papers first. Gran." Nora read the papers. Surtout. The shop was called Wren Co, which had always struck Nora as slightly mysterious, since there had never been, to her knowledge, any co involved. It sat on a narrow street in the older part of the city, between a watchmaker that kept irregular hours and a small restaurant that smelled permanently of garlic and butter. The exterior was pale blue, the paint worn at the corners, with a bay window that her grandmother had always dressed with careful arrangements of books and small potted plants. The lawyers had been in touch, as predicted. The shop was hers, along with the modest apartment above it, and a set of instructions written in the same precise hand as the letter, detailing everything from the name of the accountant to the preferred temperature for storing the older volumes in the back room. Nora was 29 years old. She worked as a project coordinator for a logistics company, and was, by her own honest assessment, competent at it without being passionate about it. She had not worked in a bookshop since she was 15, and had spent her Saturday mornings helping her grandmother dust shelves and manage the till. She stood on the pavement outside Wren Co on a bright October morning, brass key in hand, and tried to remember everything the papers had told her. The papers, as it turned out, were the interesting part. They were letters, mostly, written between her grandmother and a woman named Cecile Marsh, beginning in 1974 and continuing on and off for nearly 40 years. Cecile, as Nora had pieced together from the lawyers and a careful reading of the correspondence, had been her grandmother's closest friend, her early business partner, and the original other half of the co in Wren Co. They had opened the shop together in their late 20s, argued over the name, split the responsibilities down the middle, and run it side by side for almost a decade before Cecile had moved abroad with her husband, and her half of the partnership had been quietly and amicably transferred to Nora's grandmother alone. The letters spoke of books, mostly, of which titles to order and which to stop carrying, of a first edition that had come in unexpectedly one autumn that both of them were convinced was more valuable than anyone had offered for it, of difficult customers and wonderful ones, of the particular small joy of matching the right book to the right person on the right day. But the last letter in the stack, dated 8 months ago, was from Cecile's daughter. Her name was Diane, and she wrote to let Nora's grandmother know that Cecile had passed after a short illness, peacefully, at home, surrounded by her family. She included a telephone number, if there was anything her grandmother wished to pass along, and she mentioned, almost as a footnote, that her mother had spoken about Wren Co until nearly the end, and that there was a box of things she had always meant to return that Diane was now uncertain what to do with. Nora stood outside the shop for another moment, thinking about her grandmother keeping this to herself for 8 months, folding it in with the tissue paper and cedar and the careful instructions, and leaving it for Nora to find on a Tuesday. Then she unlocked the door. 1. The inside of the shop smelled like every bookshop Nora had ever been in, which is to say it smelled like paper and time and a faint trace of the particular wood polish her grandmother had always used. It was not large. 3 main rooms, a narrow staircase to the apartment above, a back room, with the old volumes and the specific temperature requirements. Every shelf was labeled in her grandmother's handwriting, Every label was slightly crooked, which Nora knew was not because her grandmother lacked precision, but because she had measured books by instinct rather than by ruler. She spent the first morning simply walking through it, getting reacquainted, touching the spines of books the way you might touch the arm of an old friend. She was not expecting anyone to come in, since she had not yet worked out the opening hours, or turned the sign in the window, so she startled considerably when the bell above the door rang at 10:30. The woman who came in was approximately her grandmother's age, white-haired and upright, carrying a medium-sized cardboard box under one arm, and looking around the shop with an expression Nora recognized, only because she had just felt it herself. "I tried to call ahead," the woman said, "but the number I had was old. I hope this is all right. I am Diane Marsh." Nora stared at her for a moment, then she said, "My grandmother just died." "I know," said Diane gently. "I am sorry. My mother passed 8 months ago, as I wrote. They were friends for a very long time." "I know," Nora said, and then, because she was her grandmother's granddaughter, and therefore constitutionally incapable of leaving someone standing in a doorway, she said, "Come in, please. I will make tea." They sat in the back room, among the old volumes and the carefully maintained temperature, with 2 mugs of tea and the cardboard box between them on the reading table. "My mother was not a woman who held on to things without reason," Diane said. "She kept this box for 30 years. She always said she would bring it back herself someday, and never quite managed it. After she passed, I found it with a note on top that said, 'Wren Co. Return when possible.'" Diane smiled slightly. "She was very organized." "What is in it?" Nora asked. "I looked because I needed to know where to send it. There are some letters, which I expect were your grandmother's, some photographs of the shop from when they first opened it, and a book." "A book?" Diane nodded. "It is wrapped up. I did not unwrap it. My mother's note said it belongs with the shop, and I decided to trust that." Nora reached into the box and lifted out the wrapped parcel, about the size and thickness of a notebook, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. She untied the string carefully and folded back the paper. It was a slim volume with a green cloth cover, slightly faded at the spine. On the front, in gilt letters that had aged to a dull gold, were the words, "30 Collected Tales, 1889. Nora opened the cover. Inside, on the first page, in handwriting she did not recognize, was an inscription. "To whoever tends this shop next. These were chosen with care. Choose yours the same way. E. Wren." She looked up at Diane. "E. Wren," Diane said. "My mother believed that was the original owner of this building, though she could never quite trace it definitively. She thought your grandmother bought the building from an estate sale in the 70s and found the book on a shelf in the back room." Diane paused. She kept it because it felt as though it was meant to stay. Nora looked back at the inscription, "To whoever tends this shop next." She turned the pages carefully. The book was a collection of short stories, all of them quiet and human, and concerned with ordinary lives. A shoemaker who kept a spare key for every neighbor on his street in case of emergency. A woman who planted a garden on a slope everyone said was too steep to grow anything. A young man who carried messages for people too proud to speak to each other directly, until the messages softened what stubbornness had hardened. Small stories about the persistence of ordinary kindness. "She sent it to your grandmother," Nora said slowly, "when they parted ways and Cecile moved abroad." Diane looked at the book. "She must have. She never mentioned that. She passed it on because she was leaving the shop, and she thought whoever was tending it next should have it." Nora closed the cover gently. "And my grandmother kept it, and never sent it anywhere, because she was still here. She was still the one tending it." She paused, "until she wasn't." The silence in the back room was warm, rather than heavy, the kind that settles around things that have been understood, rather than things that have been lost. Nora called her job the following Monday, and arranged a leave of absence that she privately suspected would become a resignation. She told herself she was only staying long enough to sort through the shop's affairs and determine what to do with it. She was not certain she believed herself. She reopened Wren Co. the following Wednesday, turning the sign to open at 9 in the morning, and standing behind the counter with a cup of tea, waiting to see what happened. What happened was a steady trickle of people who had been coming to the shop for years and had not known it was reopening. A man who wanted a particular novel he had been searching for since his wife had mentioned it the previous spring. Two sisters who came in together and stood in the front room for 20 minutes, arguing pleasantly over whether the other one had better taste in mysteries. An elderly gentleman who came in, looked around with something close to relief on his face, selected a book he clearly already knew exactly where to find, paid for it without looking at the price, and said on his way out that he was glad the place was still standing. Nora began to understand, in a practical and daily way, what her grandmother's letters with Cecile had meant when they talked about matching the right book to the right person on the right day. It was not a complicated skill. It required only that you pay attention to people, which was something Nora had always done, and that you trusted the books, which was something she was learning. Diane came back twice in the following weeks, the second time with her own daughter, a girl of about 12 named Iris, who had strong opinions about fantasy novels and a habit of reading the first page of a book before deciding whether it was worth her time. Nora found her a book she had not read yet and watched her stand in the front room and read the first page and then the second and then quietly sink into the window seat and keep going. "She never does that in a shop," Diane said softly, from beside Nora. "It is a very good book," Nora said. She put the green volume, 30 Collected Tales, in the window of the shop, where her grandmother had always put things that were not for sale, but were worth seeing. It sat between a small potted plant that Nora was keeping alive with moderate success, and a folded card that explained, in Nora's own handwriting, that the book had been found in the shop many years ago and had been passed from hand to hand ever since, and that it was displayed in honor of the two women who had first opened this place and chosen, in their long friendship and their quiet work, to tend something that lasted. She was not certain anyone read the card, but several people stopped to look at the book in the window, and a few of them came inside afterward, and some of them left with something under their arm that they had not expected to find when they walked in, which was, Nora was beginning to understand, the whole point. On a Friday afternoon in late November, when the light came through the bay window at an angle that turned everything in the front room a warm, particular gold, Nora sat behind the counter, with her grandmother's records open in front of her, and a cup of tea growing cold at her elbow. The shop was quiet. The street outside moved at its ordinary pace. She reached across the counter and straightened the small brass key she had started keeping there, not because it unlocked anything she had not already opened, but because it reminded her of a box on a step on a Tuesday, and of a woman who had sharp handwriting and bad knees, and knew, apparently, exactly what she was leaving behind. The bell above the door rang. A young man came in, looking uncertain in the way people sometimes did when they were not sure what they were looking for, which was the best kind of person to walk into a bookshop, because it meant there was something to find. Nora set down her pen and smiled. "Take your time," she said. "Have a look around. Let me know if I can help." He nodded and moved toward the shelves, and the afternoon continued, warm and quiet, and exactly as it should be.